Well, welcome to the first of the panels, which will take up perhaps some of the issues which have been raised already by our two keynote speakers: motivations, aspirations, and the level of satisfaction within the EU, which arose this morning. This, to some extent, of course, is an historical question, partly because those who entered the EU entered it at different times, and of course in very different geopolitical and economic contexts. Now, to help us through these issues, and each of them has undertaken to speak for no more than 50 minutes, we have four very distinguished speakers. Ulrike Guerot from Germany, who is the founder and director of the European Democracy Lab, and who wrote, I believe, not long ago, a manifesto for a European Republic. We have Ioannis Papadopoulos, who is particularly interested in the issues of accountability and governance in a transnational setting. We have Tim Garton, who needs no, I think, introduction as perhaps the most authoritative commentator in this country anyway on matters of European politics. And finally, Boguslaw, who is the editor of Poland's leading daily, Rzeczpospolita, a paper which I believe is distinguished by having its sections divided up so that news is presented in white, business in green, and legal matters in yellow. Whether yellow has the same connotation in Poland as it has in this country, I leave him perhaps to tell us later. So to begin, we have Tim Garton, and you're going to speak for 15 minutes, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I have no doubt that this is not just a crisis in Europe, but the crisis of Europe. That is to say, it is an existential crisis of the whole European project. It is that partly because of the sheer accumulation of crises, the Eurozone crisis, which, as Willem Buter rightly said, is clearly not over. The Russian aggression towards Ukraine and the threat it poses to other East European countries, not yet mentioned, but very important, the refugee crisis, the threat of Brexit, the rise of anti-system, more or less xenophobic and Eurosceptic parties of left and right all across the parties. Each of these crises reinforcing the other, but also an existential crisis because the familiar mechanism of challenge and response in European integration no longer seems to be working. The history of European integration is a history of progress through crises. Here we have the crisis, but not the progress. There's not the response, and that's because of a lack, I would argue, of some of the deeper historical drivers of European integration. We can talk about that in discussion. Now, I've spent much of my life studying Germany and Poland, but I'm going to bite my tongue, hold on about Germany and Poland to the discussion, because I've been asked to talk about Britain, and I'm going to address two simple questions. Firstly, how peculiar is Britain? And secondly, what is the likely impact of Brexit or Remain on the future of the European Union? So first of all, how peculiar are we? I mean, certainly we're very peculiar, that's for sure. But maybe we're not quite so peculiar as we pride ourselves on being. That is to say, if you ask the question, what about British attitudes to the European Union is specific and peculiar to this country as against what is to be found elsewhere in the European Union, many elements, more than we often think, are also to be found elsewhere. So, for example, clearly the lack of economic success, of growth in the core European economy, particularly in the Eurozone, is a factor deeply affecting attitudes to the European Union in many EU member states. However, I think it's true to say that it's particularly affecting Britain because of our own path to European membership, which was very largely informed by the experience of relative economic decline and the perception that continental Europe was doing better. So it was much more pragmatic and transactional. Therefore, if the European economy is doing badly, the relative impact is greater. This is brilliantly illustrated by an exchange at a recent meeting of the Polish-British Round Table, when a British economist explained to our Polish friends at great length why they would be, for economic reasons, extremely unwise to join the Eurozone. And at the end of this long and very convincing lecture, a Polish economist put up his hand and said, "But you don't understand. We want to be on board the ship even if it's sinking." And of course this is exactly right, because since Poland's Europeanism is so deeply informed by culture and historical experience, having been driven unfairly to the periphery of European affairs, or indeed wiped off the map for several long periods, we want to be at the heart of Europe for profound historical, emotional and political reasons, even if we see an economic cost. Now actually, of course, Poland has become more sceptical about European Euro membership, but nonetheless. Secondly, security, European security. If you look at the debates, and I've read the Hansard of the parliamentary debates around the time Britain joined the then European community and the subsequent 75 referendum, actually people talk obviously a lot about economy, but then they talk about security. The security motive was a major one in that debate, but it was security in the context of the Cold War, faced with the threat from the Soviet Union. So that motive is absent, but it's absent not just in Britain, it's absent in many other countries. It's one of the significant means. Now you might say, what about Vladimir Putin? You might well say. But the interesting point is that actually in West European debates and in British debates on the European Union, Putin hardly gets a look in. He should do, but he doesn't. Sovereignty and democracy, great themes of the British-European debate, but not again uniquely British. In France, there are the sovereigntists. If you look at the Polish debate at the moment, it's a debate, at least on the law and justice side, about sovereignty. If you look at the rulings of the German Constitutional Court, the combination of sovereignty and democracy is very important. However, I think it is true to say that the fact that at the very core of our constitutional tradition and arguably national British identity is the notion of parliamentary sovereignty does make the argument about sovereignty and democracy, and by the way, an absolutely genuine argument, not one just produced for the purposes of referendum, more powerful, particularly within the Westminster village, between politicians and journalists working in Westminster. Then there's the rhetoric against the elites, which you hear a lot from Nigel Farage, but now you also hear it from Boris Johnson, Eton, Balliol College, Oxford, The Spectator, so clearly a horny-handed son of toil. Charles Moore, Eton, Trinity College, Cambridge, The Spectator, another man of the people, clearly. But the rhetoric of Europe being about the elites, and we speaking for the people, is one you find across the European Union. Migration. Crucial to the result of the referendum is the migration issue. There's detailed polling which shows that in the electorate, the migration issue and the border issue has a salience second to none. It's up there, 45%, 50% of respondents. UKIP, in a sense, was a pioneer on linking migration and the European issue because of a reason that Willem Buiter mentioned, namely the sheer scale of the migration from Eastern Europe. Give or take 2 million people, which put it on the agenda, that's just a fact. But now it's routine in Eurosceptic discourse, from Jobbik, Alternative für Deutschland, starting being against the Euro, now about the refugee crisis and so on. More distinctive, I think, is the narrative of being an island that became an empire. It's very interesting that the two main documentaries about Britain and Europe so far, the BBC and ITV one, both had long footage of the White Cliffs of Dover. And if that was the most important thing to know, oh, Britain's an island. The truth is, of course, the sheer fact that Britain is an island can be interpreted in many different ways. Geography is not necessarily destiny. Norman Davis wrote a splendid book called The Isles, explaining how the history of the 4 nations on these islands is actually inextricably intertwined with those of continental Europe. But it's a narrative that draws on the island to empire. My favorite example of this is a quotation from Margaret Thatcher, and she actually said this at the Centre for Policy Studies in 1999. I quote, "God separated Britain from mainland Europe, and it was for a purpose." Now, I'm not quite so well acquainted with the thinking of the Almighty on the matter of Margaret Thatcher. I haven't interviewed him, unfortunately. But there you have it, the historical teleology, the Our Island Story school of history, the island that becomes an empire, particularly, by the way, an English narrative, less so a Scottish or Welsh or Irish narrative, although represented there too, but at the moment, I think, reinforced by, and this is a really distinctive feature of this country, an overwhelmingly Eurosceptic press. And that is something you don't find anywhere else to the same degree, and its extremely biased news stories about the European Union are tied together by a meta-narrative of the island that became an empire and is therefore irrevocably different from continental Europe. Just one example, for reasons of time, the Sun's front page, when Tony Blair signed up to the Constitutional Treaty, full page with illustrations. 1588, we saw off the Spanish. 1805, we saw off the French. 1940, we saw off the Germans. 2003, Blair surrenders Britain to Europe. The drip, drip, drip of this Eurosceptic coverage is not to be underestimated. The last peculiar factor I would mention, and I will do it with telegraphic brevity for reasons of time, is a fact of, so to speak, political group biography. The main protagonists of the Eurosceptic cause and the Brexit cause in Britain are overwhelmingly Thatcher's children. Margaret Thatcher, by far the most formative influence on British political thinking after Winston Churchill. Now, of course, her legacy is ambivalent, because on the one hand, she was actually the person who pushed through the single market, so that many of these so-called European laws that we have to abide by actually are regulations to do with the European market, work of Margaret Thatcher. On the other hand, she was Madame No, 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 God has separated us from the continent. And the Thatcherite story is one of national revival in spite of Europe. An analytically curious proposition, given that the period of this national revival is actually one in which Britain was a member of the European Union. But nonetheless, the power over narrative over reality. That said, I want to emphasize that the evidence is very clear, and our title involves the words levels of satisfaction. Although Britain in the Eurobarometer polling has consistently been one of the most Eurosceptic countries, there is no absolutely settled, firm majority against the European Union. There's a lot of good work on this by Robert Worcester of Mori, by YouGov. A study was done more recently for the European movement. There has always been, there was in the 1975 referendum, there is today, a soft, undecided middle, which is very large. The detailed polling study for the European movement identified the two largest groups in the British electorate, being a group of 7.5 million people estimated, which they called hearts versus heads. The head is for leaving, the heart is for leaving, but the head is for staying. And 9.5 million people, rather unattractively identified as the young, apathetic middle. I suppose it beats being the old, apathetic middle. Anyway, these vast groups of the undecided for which the two campaigns are now competing. Now, I already have 2 bottles riding on Britain staying in, and if the bookies are to be believed, and I trust the bookies rather more than the posters, I may win those bottles. But I'm not going to indulge in sort of futile crystal ball gaming. I'm going to jump immediately to my final point, which is about the impact on the future of Europe, disintegration versus integration of Brexit or Remain. It seems to me self-evident that Brexit would be a massive catalyst of a wider disintegration of the European project. The negotiations themselves would be lengthy and bloody and difficult, there's no doubt about that, would slow the whole process down. The sense of European integration having been some sort of Whig forward march, irreversible in some important sense, would be delivered a body blow. There would be a demonstration effect with people like countries like Hungary, Denmark perhaps, the Alternative für Deutschland, at least to some extent, being encouraged by the British example. What is more, and I think this is an important point which is too seldom stressed, the classic British approach to Europe in modern history has been that of balancing, being somewhat apart from the continent, but ensuring that no power or alliance dominates the continent. Since 2011, the British government has departed from this classic approach because the Treasury concluded that the Eurozone had to be deepened, to be further integrated, otherwise it would fall apart with disastrous consequences for that. And therefore the British government is not just saying, okay guys, go ahead. It is saying, please go ahead. Integrate more to save the Eurozone. In other words, go right ahead, Napoleon. Something that no British leader has ever said before. But if Britain were out, then it is highly probable that it would revert to the classic British role of trying to balance, and there would be other European powers, probably not those of the Eurozone, who would look to Britain as an ally. Finally, it seems to me that one of the most important things for the future of European integration is our external policy, common foreign and security policy. How can you make an effective common foreign and security policy with Britain outside it? So I think Brexit, the case is clear. Remain, in the first moments, weeks and months, would clearly swing the dial back towards integration if the most Eurosceptic country in the European Union had looked at the thing very coldly without sentiment and decided to remain. That would be positive. And I think you could see some positive initiatives by the British government, single market, financial services, digital, perhaps even on foreign and security policy. Of course, a lot depends on how big the majority is. But, and this is my final point, and it goes back to what Chris Patton said earlier, the Conservative Party is tearing itself apart in a most brutal fashion before our eyes over this issue. Therefore, it is already clear that the priority of whoever the next leader is, and it probably still be David Cameron, will be healing. And Theresa May's leadership application speech, which he delivered a few days ago, showed exactly what it will look like. Yes, we're for staying in the EU, but very sceptical about the European Convention on Human Rights. So that the task of healing the Conservative Party would, I think, leave you with the British government for some years to come, which would continue to be a drag on further steps of integration, except within the Eurozone, which it has decided is in our interest, at least until 2020, when we might have another government, possibly till 2025. I don't exclude the possibility that at some subsequent point, 2020, 2025, if the rest of the European Union is seen to be doing well again, then Britain, Johnny-come-lately once again, would become a motor of European integration again. But I don't think even in the Remain scenario that that's going to happen anytime soon. So if there are to be major motors of European integration, I'm afraid it's going to have to be Germany. So that's when I hand over to Ulrike. Thank you.
So our second speaker is indeed Ulrike Garton.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here, but the introduction does not mean that I defend Germany or that I'm defending German politics or the European Union when Timothy hands it over to me. I'm pleased to be here, and still I cannot hold back a little footnote because I've been traveling much in recent days and weeks throughout Europe, from Budapest to Warsaw to Vienna to Paris and much more. And so I start many times looking into the room and thinking sort of, to whom am I speaking? And because audience matters. Who is speaking on Europe is part perhaps of the European problem. And today it's very different to whom you speak. And this audience is, say, in gender and generational proportions not really homogeneous and probably not really representing average. And it is important to say this because it allows us to mirror who does these questionnaires about the political economy of the European Union and why it went wrong, and we are the insiders and we have all these things. But people in a normal city town hall, they don't know this, and I think it's very important to keep this in mind, to whom we are talking and who talks Europe. And my experience is that if I talk to really young audiences, they have just no idea of what we are talking about. Even instructed students at the Bucerius Law School in Germany, who is the Bucerius Law School, sort of one of these privileged schools where the kids of the wealthy go, would not know who Jacques Delors is, would not know what the Maastricht Treaty is, would not know what the Maastricht Treaty was meant for, and so on and so forth. And I'm just saying this, that we put ourselves into sort of a mindset with what we are dealing when perhaps we need to face a real rupture in the European narrative just because of lack of knowledge. The other point from my travel experience is that I think we do not realize in rooms like this how worse it is, or how bad it is, I should say. If you are in Vienna, as I was 2 days ago, and you see sort of Austrian elites talking about Hofer, and basically seeing their system slipping into Hofer without really knowing what should they do and what can they do, with having a potential president announcing that he would be an active president, he would not be a sort of peaceful president, not using all the potential of the Austrian constitution, then you get a little glimpse on how quickly systems can be lost. And you can see it, can watch it, and you can nothing do against it. It happened in Budapest. I don't know who of you has been in Budapest recently, but it's a sad experience. You have been to Warsaw, but we will have a Polish speaker, but I myself had 5 Polish friends who lost jobs in liberal progressive journals. So we can see things. We have a Polish ombudsman, correct me if I'm wrong, who's struggling to get the formal sort of mistakes of the government out for the Vienna Convention. The report is due on June 23rd on the Article 7 proceedings, and he is having a hard time in his own bureaucracy to getting the formal mistakes that Kaczynski may have made to sort of proving wrong on Article 7. It probably will not work and will probably not have a big effect. So that's the third country, Hungary, Austria, Poland. Country next, go to Paris, watch what is happening there with a president which is basically in an effritement politique total, which is less than 20% of support by the people. A French left which is completely without sort of any figure who could jump into that vacuum. Neither Macron nor Valls are considered by any means left by the French left. Sarkozy is, to put it mildly, corrupted, and so if he wins, he will probably not be a president which has a comfort zone. So can you imagine the thing in France, what happens, even if Marine Le Pen is not winning, she is in the second round, and she will probably get more than 40%. And that alone will make France a different France. And it's happening in 8 months. So my second point here is, I think we have to come to grips with the fact that we lost the system. It just happened. And the man who was telling me this in that very sentence was, I think Timothy was even present in the room when we had the ECFR Council meeting in November 2011, and Marty Ahtisaari, who you all know, made a keynote, and the first sentence was, when I was young, reading the history books, I never understood how the elites by then could lose the system. Now, I understand. And I wrote this sentence down in November 2011, and I feel like evermore how right he was. So now the problem is, when did we lose the system? If there's some analysis that perhaps we may have done so. I go back to what Timothy says. I go back to what many in the keynotes of this morning said. And I would say, if the historians once upon a time should sort of go over the curve, and when did it happen, this sort of heating of the frog, this momentum which you feel unable to stop, I think it was somewhere around 2011 and 2012. And there I share Timothy when he said that there was a decision of the British government, there was a decision to say, look, if this Eurozone does not integrate more, it will not function. I remember quite well, and Timothy, you were also there, the Königswinter talks in April 2011. This was, I think, one of the most toughest German-British encounter that we have ever seen. And I think the moment was by then when the British government made just the choice of the Eurozone will not do it. And so we will have to have a strategy which cuts us from that. If we lost the system around in 2011, I also go with Timothy, that emotions matter. People also do have memory. And as a German, I say the following sentence, which we may discuss. At a moment in time when the European Germany was not on offer, and the choice was German Europe or no Europe, many countries choose no Europe, and that's the price we pay today. That's a sentence that people of my government do not want to listen, but I'm not paid by the German government. I think the analysis is pretty easy. If you go back to the documents of basically the June Council 2012, we know that that was the council with the vicious circle of sovereign debt and bank debt. There was promises, there were over-promises, the promises weren't held, they weren't held with respect to Ireland, they weren't held with respect to many countries. You look at the report of December, 5th of December 2012, the first report of the 5 presidents, there were still motions in there, still the hope the 4 buildings block of genuine economic and monetary union would work. That was the moment where the French shifted the hope that the Germans would do some of the fiscal union stuff as necessity, as mentioned by Mr. Patton this morning. It wasn't done, and because it wasn't done, since 4 years the system is in derail. That would be my offer for an analysis. So what we didn't do, my third point, is basically we did not do the things we should have done and the things we knew we should do. There are even quotes around from nobody less than Jean-Claude Juncker. We know what we have to do, unfortunately we cannot do it. Yeah? This is the catch-22 of the European systems. We all know from system theory that complex systems in the moment of a crisis cannot reform. This is probably the situation of the European Union. You can also quote Antonio Gramsci. I know this is not a fortunate quote, but yeah, if the old cannot die and the new cannot be born, we live in the times of the monster. This is probably applicable to the European Union system governments today. So, if we could not produce the positive integration, like it is called in political science, which is social and democratic Europe, then what we are paying as price today is, again, what mentioned Timothy, I think quite accurately, and I think the British figures he quoted are also the figures of most of the European sort of populations. I looked at figures and I traveled a lot, and I would say that in most cities of Europe today, you find a sort of 70% majority for somehow Europe. Nobody wants populism, nobody wants nationalism, nobody wants to renationalize, the people want to stay with the euro, that is all fine. But the systems, the national systems, are driven by an anti-EU sentiment. And the problem is that the two things do not match. Where people want Europe but a different Europe, which is a democratic and social Europe, but not on offer in concrete policy terms, because there's no party out there who offers in concrete terms democratic and social integration or positive integration of Europe. So this is in policy terms not on offer, but people want that Europe. The only thing which is on offer is EU, more integration or leave it. And so that's what you get. We have a political class which is squeezed in an argument that this is the Europe we need to defend, this is the EU we need to defend. That's what the people do not want. They do not want this EU in these conditions. Most of them do not want to exit, but the 30% who run the populist voices in most of the European countries today are squeezing the political national systems to the right. There's no way out because the current system of the EU democracy or the flawed institutional system of the EU cannot even mirror these majorities because the system is not modeled to produce an aggregated European majority. That's what we have seen in the Netherlands, because it's very astonishing that some Dutch want to decide over Ukrainian EU association agreement, which is in terms of democracy at least sort of completely flawed. So we do not want this, but we do not have any opportunity to model a pan-European or post-national democratic aggregated vote in the system. So the system is flawed to the extent that it can only produce national, more and more populist solution. And this is the price we pay. So I come to my fifth point. We lost politics in the whole system, and because we lost politics, we are basically offering governance and technocracy to sort of keep it at least stable and not lose the euro. If you say this like Jürgen Habermas said in his recent book, and I think he published it even in Oxford Press in April 2015, The Lure of Technocracy. You are Jürgen Habermas and you do a fantastic analysis about the lure of technocracies and everybody gives you applauses. When your name is Marine Le Pen and you say basically the same thing on a given French marketplace, that the European system is flawed, you're a populist. And I just don't understand how we could come there. That basically people saying the right things are populist in our systems. And I think this is the price we pay for not tackling or not being able to reform the system. So I come back, because I'm German, that's my last point, to the sentence of Angela Merkel, which you all know: if the euro fails, 2010, then Europe fails. And I think she was really wrong. Because the real sentence is, if the euro stays as it is, European democracy will fail. And this is what we're experiencing. We are having failing national democracies. We are unable to rebuild a post-national European democracy which would use the system as it would. So we do not have input legitimacy. We are still coping with a completely flawed notion of sovereignty. We do not have division of power, which is the most noble paradigm for any given parliamentarian democracy, and we could not build this on the European level. And I'm speaking here in an English room, we do not have a system which is built on the principle of equal liberty, which is the classic moment of John Locke when he was writing his papers. Equal liberty is that any understanding of liberalism needs to come along with equality, which is equality in front of the law. That goes back to Cicero, jus equium, equal law for all citizens. And the British writings of the 17th, who have been designing basically the British parliamentarism in the Putney Papers, were all about equal liberty. So if the European Union today does not offer one crucial thing, then it is precisely that: equal liberty, which is liberty in front of the law for all the citizens. And that is now my last sentence. This is, I think, why Pierre Rosanvallon, the French sociologist who I really admire, just said in Warsaw on a panel the following sentence, which I give you in English. He said it in French: the European Union has been built on a lie, and today we are paying the price. So what is the lie? The lie is that in the Maastricht Treaty we were told that we were building a union of citizens and a union of states. Actually, we just have a union of states, and the union of citizens is a rule. Why? Because if the UK should decide to leave, and if Cameron goes down that route and leaves, you could imagine that because we are also a union of the citizens, the British people stay citizens of the European Union in full sovereign right as citizens. Actually, they don't. The union citizenship of the European Union is linked to the state citizenship of the UK. If the UK leaves, you as British citizens, you also lose your European citizenship. And this is the fundamental lie of the structure of the Maastricht Treaty, because sovereign is not a state. Sovereign is only the citizen and the people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ulrike. Our third speaker is Ioannis Papadopoulos.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me first warmly thank the organizers for their kind invitation and for allowing me to share with you my thoughts on Greece in the context of that exciting conference. What I would like to do today is present a historical outlook together with some data in order to identify mainly what is distinctive or not in the Greek case. Well, in historical terms, what we have observed in Greece is a phase of increasing support for European integration, followed by a phase of erosion. Let me start by reminding that Greece joined the then European Economic Community in 1981. Greece applied for accession in 1975, shortly after the re-establishment of democratic rule. And I think it's important to remind and to underline that even though accession was expected to bolster economic development in Greece, well, the main reasons for joining the EEC at the time were clearly political. There was at the time a strong political will to consolidate the new Greek democracy by anchoring it to Europe. This will was mainly incarnated domestically in Greece by the Prime Minister, Constantine Karamanlis, and it was shared in Europe by key players such as French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing or German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. And in a sense, Greece received then a special treatment. For example, Spain and Portugal belonged to the same wave of democratization of the 1970s. However, Greece joined the EEC much earlier than these two other countries, which only joined in 1986. Now, although Greece joined the EEC before Spain and Portugal, paradoxically, it was among the three countries of that enlargement, the one in which domestic political or partisan support at the time for EEC membership was the lowest. The Conservative New Democracy Party, which was led by Karamanlis and which formed the government, actively supported the accession process, and the same applied to the Centrist Party. However, the main opposition party, PASOK, the Socialist Party, main opposition party since 1977, that was led by Andreas Papandreou, also the smaller pro-Soviet Communist Party, they both strongly opposed the European community. PASOK's anti-EC rhetoric, for example, was based on an analysis that was heavily drawing on dependency and center-periphery theory. And to take the analysis a bit further, I think one needs to scrutinize why and how such discourses resonated with deeper mass beliefs shared by the population. Now, of course, the anti-capitalist rhetoric was, as such, was the privilege of the Greek left. However, I believe that it found fertile soil in more deeply entrenched anti-Western feelings that animate broad segments of the Greek society, and importantly, to a large extent, regardless of any political differences. Greek political scientist and then European Ombudsman Nikiforos Diamandouros emphasized the existing dualism in Greek political culture, which is divided, according to him, between an underdog and a modernizing political culture. Maybe a few words of caution here. Well, this is clearly a value-laden distinction, because the modernizing culture is described in a favorable light, whereas the underdog culture is viewed as pre-modern and introverted and defensive. However, empirically, such a distinction, I think, is very relevant. The second word of caution is that, well, one encounters similar cleavages along extraversion and introversion, obviously, in many European societies. However, a distinctive Greek feature lies in the fact that introversion takes this specific form of anti-Occidentalism. In other words, the rejection of the values associated with Western Europe, something that one finds in other Orthodox countries such as Russia, but probably not in other EU member states. Another distinctive feature is that such a culture in Greece is highly narcissistic and associated with an exaggerated sense of self-esteem. Also, I dare say, a touch of arrogance, which probably makes the label underdog a bit misleading. According to a major recent survey in Greece, the Ioannis survey of 2015, more than 70% of the sample believe that Greece has something important to offer to the West, something that the West doesn't have, and that was part of the question. And the clear majority also believes that the EU has benefited from Greek membership, not the other way around. The EU has benefited from Greek membership. Interestingly, there are no major differences depending on political affiliation, support for European integration, or any social demographic characteristics. Diamandouros correctly argued that elements of both cultures are to be found across the political spectrum. However, only marginal segments within the Greek left supported European integration, and the Greek left continues to be Eurosceptic nowadays. In the other countries of the South European enlargement, by contrast, the Spanish and the Portuguese socialist parties were much closer to social democratic positions than PASOK, and therefore supported EEC membership. So the partisan consensus on accession and membership was much broader in these countries than in Greece. PASOK came to power in October 1981, less than a year after Greece's accession. It had meanwhile watered down its anti-integration rhetoric, calling for a vague sort of special relationship with the EC, which, by the way, never materialized. And in fact, the PASOK governments did not challenge Greek membership. What happened in practice is that they demanded derogations and more generous aids. Several aid programs were drawn up in that period. Unfortunately, as you may know, a substantial amount of the money that Greece received was not used to develop infrastructures or to modernize the economic structures due to the lack of capacity of the Greek administration, to clientelism, or to the combination of both. However, PASOK's more pragmatic attitude towards the EC in the 1980s and the 1990s, combined with the fact that Greece enjoyed the material benefits of membership, well, these are factors that concurred to an attitudinal change. The left-right cleavage of the second part of the 1970s with respect to membership was replaced by what I call the permissive consensus à la grecque. It is often argued in the political science literature that there is support for the process of European integration as long as it enjoys output legitimacy. Well, that was clearly the case in Greece. The EU was positively associated with the material benefits that it delivered. The conversion was, however, superficial. Support for the EU has mainly been of an instrumental nature in Greece, related to the benefits that the EU was perceived to deliver. It was underpinned by a consequentialist logic. Support was the result of cost-benefit calculations and anticipations, contingent on the positive output that could be attributed to the Union. I'm not naive. I don't think that in other countries, especially in Southern Europe, the grounds for support, perhaps also for the decline of support more recently, for integration are considerably different, and Professor Garton referred to that regarding the Great Britain as well. So more generally, the initial permissive consensus in Europe in favor of integration never was a love affair, and it has been eroded in other countries. However, what I want to say is that the nature of support for the EU in Greece can explain both its rise and its amplitude before the crisis, and its decline afterwards. The main problem with that kind of support is its fragility. Fragility due to the shallowness of support and its superficiality. When EU membership is no longer associated with benefits, but with costs, comes with costs, such as austerity measures, support tends to erode, if not to collapse. It is therefore not surprising that austerity led to disaffection, and this has been aggravated by the fact that austerity is perceived in Greece as externally imposed, preventing thus the development of any feeling of ownership over policies. Unlike in other countries, even right-wing parties in Greece did not support austerity measures or even just modernization reforms, or if they did it in the end, it was quite reluctantly, and this is again largely due to the clientelist nature of the Greek political system. Let me now give you very quickly some illustrations which are drawn from Eurobarometer data, which I found quite telling with regard to the evolution and the decline of support for the EU in Greece. There are questions in Eurobarometer surveys which aim to measure, they are phrased differently, whether people believe that their country benefits from the European Union, whether they value integration benefits, or whether they have a positive image of the European Union. Interestingly, the response pattern is similar in all these questions. What do I mean by that? 10 or 15 years ago, the Greeks had much more favorable views on the EU than the EU average. Nowadays, it's a reverse. Nowadays, Greeks tend to have much more negative opinions than the European average. You see, you have a similar pattern in these three questions that are posed to a sample of Europeans and obviously Greeks as well. Let me refer to the last question. The last question I wanted to refer to is slightly different. It's a question about the way democracy works in the European Union. We have the same pattern here. As you can see, the Greeks have now a level of satisfaction with democracy in the EU, by the way, with national democracy as well, which is pretty lower than the EU level. Of course, this may not surprise us if we consider that Greece has become a semi-vassal state. Semi-vassal state is the description of Greece in the program of today's event. Interestingly, this is also the kind of framing or of narrative that has been dominating Greek political discourse since the crisis. Obviously, the convergence of a Euroscepticist, national, populist narrative across left and right, again, it's not a Greek peculiarity. It is, I think, nevertheless alarming that the spread of Euroscepticist beliefs tends to be associated in Greece with the delegitimation of national democratic institutions. According to a very recent survey by the University of Macedonia in Thessaloniki, a survey that was published few days ago, 45%, almost half of the respondents, believe in Greece that elections, national elections, are not important because whatever their outcome, and whatever their outcomes, it's the foreigners that decide. So this belief that the national democracy is hollowed out is even more widespread among the younger generations. And I would nevertheless like to conclude with an optimistic note, although an optimistic note assorted with a plea. I would like to say a few words on the interpretation of last year's referendum vote in Greece, July 2015, which point out, according to me, in the direction of optimism, moderate optimism. So, of course, you know that over 60% of the voters voted no last July. We all know also that voters' motivations are complex and vary a lot. However, only a small proportion of the no voters were in favor of Greece leaving the Eurozone. According to the same Diagnosis survey, 75% are in favor of the Euro. Less than 20% are so Eurosceptic that they are resolutely in favor of leaving the EU. So obviously the majority in the referendum wanted the Euro without the conditionality that goes with it. This is of course naive. But I think more interesting is the fact that almost 40% of the voters voted yes under the knowledge of and in spite of the hard conditions associated with the pack of measures that was submitted to them. Obviously, many among those who voted yes in the Greek referendum suffered from the crisis too. So this 40% is quantitatively equivalent to what the Diagnosis survey, to which I referred before, has identified as the pro-European pillar in Greek society. Significantly, 40% after the erosion of support related to the crisis. The intriguing point, however, is that even this pro-European segment in Greece believes that the European Union is dominated by Germany, about 3/4 of the respondents, and also, although less frequently, about half of the group, that the EU seeks to subjugate Greece. So even this pro-European segment has a disenchanted, if not negative view of the European Union. I am convinced that we need, that's my plea, that we need to counteract this widespread perception that Greece is and will remain a semi-vassal state, because otherwise we produce Europhobes. Obviously, Greece's sovereignty has been reduced due to its condition of a debtor country. However, originally at least, Greece's problems were largely homemade. Let me also remind that Greece voluntarily decided to join the Eurozone and to continue being part of it, and this simply entails obligation. The problem is, however, that most Greek parties, including above all the parties composing the current government, are reluctant to argue along these lines. They have largely opted for blame shifting and overpromising. This has inevitably increased the expectations gap among the population, and it has led to this phenomenon of political cynicism. Such phenomena do not only weaken pro-European attitudes in Greece, but, and probably more alarmingly according to me, they also cause prejudice to the legitimacy of national democratic institutions. So we have here a negative spillover effect, which in my view is a major problem, and I think we should give it serious consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. And our fourth speaker is Boguslaw Chrabota.
Hello everybody. It's a great privilege and big honor and pleasure to be here. According to the timeline, the schedule, I think I have enough time to say hello and just come into conclusions. It limits my presentation very, very much. So I will do my best to shut it up and to say some words about Poland. If anybody is interested in the presentation, I can offer it just free of charge after this session. So first slide is to show you the basic dates related to our integration, and the conclusion is that that's not a very long period of time, as you see, 22 years from the very beginning. Means that it's not, especially from the point of view of these university walls, it's a very short term. I'm a journalist, I'm not a sociologist, but I would like to be very close to strict facts in what I say. Because especially today that we have a very tough political war in Poland, it's necessary to present facts. Politicians, as you know, produce a lot of emotions instead of making politics, and that's the problem of Poland today. So, being close to facts, I will start off with the date of 1994 that Poland announced the need of integration and just started the process. As you see, Poland was not very much wanted in European Union. As you see, 51% next to Sweden, 79, Austria 75, etc. Okay. As you see, this one slides is extremely important from the point of view of our integration, because these are expectations for Poland in Union. From our side, these were challenges for our government. Things to do in Poland for our European standards. And it's very interesting to see, that's the next part of the presentation, how people find it today. Okay, attitude to enlargement in the course of the negotiations process. There is a book published probably 2003 or 2004 presenting the attitude, and here you have a key findings, conclusions coming to Poland, as you see. And the conclusion is simple. This process for everybody, for both sides, I mean European Union, 12 countries, and also Poles, the process is needed, but will be painful, as you see. You have another slide, polls on European integration, results of public opinion surveys. What do Polish people think about integration were very interested in this. And as you see, it's a big change over 10 years. The very beginning was not so good. 29% of interested people, 69% not interested in all. But during 10 years, this interest doubled, even more than doubled. 64% in 2002. And another interesting slide, next one. Do you feel informed about the planned Polish integration with the European Union? And as you see, on a period of 5-6 years, the level of people who felt being informed well not increased very much, as you see. That's probably due to a not very good activity of Polish government, just informing people about the future, about the European Union standards, etc. And here we have one of the crucial slides. Since '94, CBOS, the surveying company, public one, has regularly asked the respondents if a referendum was held in Poland on accession to the European Union, would you vote for or against? And as you see, since the very beginning, the answer was very high, and the level was high, 77, 72%, 94, 95. Then it was a decrease of the bottom point in 2001, March, May, and then July. And just after 2001, you can guess what's the reason. The support was going up again, just to 62% in 2002 May. It's a mistake, 2002, as you see in the top. Why I'm just focusing on this period, because we had a very heavy campaign for voting 2002 in spring, March to May. And you see the growth of people who supported accession. And the next one is also important. These are reasons for voting. And as you see, the most important arguments were reducing unemployment, greater chance for finding a job. This is 26%. I just divided into two parts. I mean, concrete benefits coming from accession and abstract arguments. So, watch benefits from opening borders. It's only 5%. How it changes today, you will see later on. That's just before integration. The main conclusions, what people think, day before. As you see, they are full of abuse, self-confident, and a bit fatalistic about the common future in United Europe. And another slide shows you the day after accession. These are years 2004 to 2008, and it's incredible, this upper line, that the enthusiasm for European Union grows very fastly. It's going up faster than among citizens of new countries, new European countries, and EU citizens too. Enthusiasm grows. And one more slide. Support for Polish membership in the EU, in various social groups. Of course, there's the benefit and there's the fruits. These are fruits for upmarket people. So among youngsters, among business people, among managers, the support is much higher. And then one more thing, perception of the benefits from the EU, that's incredible. 2004, 2008, all these figures are growing rapidly, as you see, except one, the negative financial situation of state enterprises. That's not very much growing, but also grows. So, Europe produces a very positive perspective for these even state-owned companies. Worse salaries and wages. There is one problem with Eurozone and support for Eurozone integration. At the very beginning, 2002, before we joined the European Union, it was much bigger, and it was the only period in history that support for euro as a currency was really high. It was, as you see, 64%. And then rapidly, after accession, it was going down and down. Today, only 14% of people support our accession to Eurozone. And now we are coming into the close future, even contemporary Polish problems. How are Poland's relations with the EU changing under law and justice, political dominance? And as you see, there's a dispute about if it's beneficial or unbeneficial. Majority of society, 32%, say that it's unbeneficial. And another question of refugees, one of the basic threats for Polish people today, among terrorism and Brexit also. I think that it was not enough time for Polish elite to produce solidarity values. It's incredible, because Poland was just related to solidarity at the very beginning of its new history in the 80s. And now, solidarity in other terms, in terms of solidarity with another people coming from North Africa or Middle East, doesn't exist anymore. But, as you see, the continuity is possible of the previous government promises. And that's one more, pause and acceptance of refugees from Middle East and North Africa. That shows you that the solidarity in a wider human value sense is not so optimistic. And I'm coming to the final slides. This shows us absolutely important from the point of view of what I want to say to you, because you see the period of 2012 until 2016. Watch the support for European Union among Polish people. It's always over 80%. It was only once, April, May 2013, that it was down under 80%, but it's absolutely constant. What does it mean? That it's very difficult to manipulate Poles with the idea of Euroskepticism and leaving the Union. It shows you much, this slide shows it much better.
Last point.
Coming to the end. Okay, that's something new, as you know. And opinion of polls about the procedure of protecting democracy issued by European Parliament. 37% people say justified. Plus, one more. Three biggest advantages of Poland being a member of the European Union. Poland receives EU funds. Number two, open borders between member states, 72.8. And learning opportunities outside of Poland, 47.4. Keep in mind that 12 years ago, Schengen idea was not so much accepted or understood. And the last one is indicate up to the three biggest drawbacks of Poland being a member of the European Union. And number one is, as you see, imposition by the European Union of laws that we must follow. It's a bit dangerous for future. Okay, so coming to conclusions and saying goodbye to you from this point, I want to point out generally 80% of support among Polish people for European Union. No bigger space for Eurosceptical political power like Jobbik in Hungary. Superficial European self-consciousness of Polish people, definitely. Egoistically, national point of view. Interest before values. European identity coming from political and economic side, not from European axiology. It's after 22 years of our way to and with Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much.